my name is Schyler Church. I am a California real estate broker as well as a member of the education department at Accredited Real Estate Schools. As you probably have seen, if you are a licensed agent in California, that the Department of Real Estate submitted an advisory out telling everyone what the changes to the buyer representation and compensation look like. And it's an amended advisory since they did an update just recently. They emailed it out, but they also have it on their website as well as a video from the commissioner. So what I wanted to do was kind of go through this advisory, go through the important terms and kind of what it means. But again, I am not the Department of Real Estate. I am not your broker. I'm not an MLS or the local associations. So always consult legal advice from the Department of Real Estate, legal counsel, your broker, etc. for the most up-to-date, accurate information. And I have linked this advisory below if you want to check it out yourself. But I want to go through the most important information about what has been changing and what is changing come January 1st, 2025 to buyer broker representation and compensation. So let's get to it. So, what do licensees need to know? The changes to buyer representation and compensation. So, what is happening is it is changing significantly. And if you belong to this settlement that you might have been hearing about, well, it's already changed for you. But come January 1st, 2025, anybody that is licensed in California, now things will be changing as of January 1st, and we'll be getting into that as well. So due to a nationwide settlement of numerous class action lawsuits alleging antitrust violations against these industry associations, multiple listing services, and large national brokerages, the plaintiffs alleged that these entities were engaging in anti-competitive practices that were basically artificially inflating home prices and the commissions. So there was a settlement then that came about of this. So if you belong to this settlement, then as of a few months ago, things have already changed of our practice. And because back previously, and if you don't belong to this settlement, then you are able to do cooperative commissions, where the seller and the listing agent would usually set the commission for both the seller's agent and the buyer's agent. So at the time of the listing agreement, the seller would say, hey, you know what? I'll do a 5% commission, let's say. 5%, and that is going to be for my agent. And then my agent will be able to share the commission with the agent of the buyer. And so usually they'd split it 50-50. So 2.5 would be for the seller's agent and 2.5 would be for the buyer's agent. That was past practice. And if you do not belong to the settlement, you are still, as of right now, able to do cooperative commissions. This is changing, though, for everyone come January 1st. So if you belong to one of these industry associations, multiple listing services, or large national brokerages that was named in the settlement, well, you are now basically going to be following the terms of the settlement. If you do not belong to it, you do not have to follow the terms of the settlement. However, things are changing for everyone come January 1st, and we'll be talking about it. So if you are someone that belongs to these local associations, these industry associations, these multiple listing services, and large brokerages that were named, well, now the seller and the listing agent can no longer determine compensation for the buyer's agent. The buyer's agent is going to have to directly negotiate their compensation with their client, the buyer. So the buyer is going to be the one determining, and their agent, how much they'll get paid. But then how will they get paid? Well, that is what we'll be talking about in a moment. But these settlement terms are extremely extensive. The key things to it, that if you are representing a buyer, you need to make sure to have a signed representation agreement with your buyer. And it has to be done prior to touring any property, even if it's a virtual, you have to have that signed agreement. And in that agreement, it's addressing the compensation. So what the buyer is agreeing to pay their agent. And whatever that compensation that is agreed to in that buyer broker representation agreement, that is the most that agent will be paid. So if we try to negotiate with the seller to cover as a concession the cost of the commission to the to the buyer's agent, well, the most that will be paid is what was agreed to by the buyer. And again, if you belong to the settlement, then you have to follow the terms of the settlement. If you do not belong to it, you do not have to follow it. So now everyone, as of January 1st, 2025, if you are a California real estate agent, you now have to listen and going to be having to follow these laws that are going to be implemented. Even if you do not belong to the settlement, you now have to follow this new law. And that's the Assembly Bill 2992. And so all buyer's agents in California as of January 1st, 2025, they are going to be required to sign a buyer broker representation agreement with their buyer clients as soon as practicable, but no later than the execution of the buyer's offer to purchase real property. So no matter what, if you are a agent in California, you are going to be in representing a buyer, you now have to have a written buyer broker representation agreement that dictates what you are doing, what services you're providing, and the compensation and the expiration date. It has to be in writing. Even if you do not belong to the settlement, you now have to abide by this law. So the timing is different. So everyone, no matter what, the law is that you need to now have this in writing prior to submitting an offer. However, we get a little stricter though if you belong to the settlement. If you belong to the settlement, you have to have it actually prior to touring a home. So a little different here. If you do not belong to the settlement, it just has to be done as soon as practicable, but definitely before submitting an offer. However, if you belong to the settlement, it's stricter. It has to be prior to touring a home. And it's going to require the agreement to discuss the compensation, the services that are going to be rendered, when compensation is due, and the date when the agreement shall expire. And by California law, they say that this agreement cannot be any more than 3 months. So 3 months is the maximum for how long the agreement can be valid for. And the DRE, Department of Real Estate, is going to be enforcing compliance with Assembly Bill 2992 because this is actual legislation. This is the law. They will be enforcing it, California real estate law, as well as this Assembly Bill. However, the DRE is not involved with enforcing the settlement. That is going to be where the local associations, the multiple listing services, the brokerages that were named in it, if you belong to it, you have to abide by the settlement terms. And then otherwise, those entities will be enforcing that. So just know 2 different things, but now everyone, no matter what you are in California, if you're a California real estate agent representing a buyer as of January 1st, you have to have that written buyer broker representation agreement. Now, the exact terms will change if you are belong to the settlement, because then it's a little stricter on when you have to have it signed. And so now that we've talked about the contract, the buyer broker representation agreement that needs to be signed, well, what does this mean for the buyer actually being paid? So when the buyer agrees in the representation agreement to pay their agent these, let's say they're going to pay 3% of the purchase price. Well, they could be agreeing to do so out of pocket, where the buyer is coming up with that cash, they're paying it from their own funds. The buyer could also request that the seller pay, though, some or all of the compensation that is going to be owed to their agent. And that would be then as a concession, so a credit. And the seller could accept that. And if the seller does, then they might say, I'm going to cover maybe $10,000. I might cover 1% of it to go towards the commission for the buyer's agent. The seller could just flat out reject it too. And the buyer, if they proceed with the acquisition of that property, well, then the buyer is on the hook. They remain financially responsible for paying their agent because in that buyer broker representation agreement, they agreed to the compensation. Okay, so at that point in time, a way out of it would be if there was an exit clause. So if that buyer broker representation agreement contained an exit clause, or that the buyer's broker relieves the buyer of their obligation to pay, well, then the buyer could proceed with purchasing that property and not have to pay their agent. The agent would basically back out of the deal, and it would be basically being unrepresented. That buyer would be now no longer represented by that agent, and they could go to the agent of the seller and see about possibly getting a dual agency representation. If the buyer's agent does not relieve them and there's not an exit clause, well, then remember, the buyer is still on the hook for paying them if they proceed with the sale. So the option would be, if before actually agreeing to the agreement between the seller and the buyer of purchasing that property, well, they could back out, walk away, find a different property, presumably one that will have the seller agree to be paying for the agent's commission as a concession. So provide a credit for that. So these are kind of the options. As you can see, it's a little bit harder to understand than when we used to do the cooperative commissions, but this is to be where the seller, they don't have to pay for it. They don't need to. This is completely at the buyer. If they say, hey, I agree to pay this amount, to you, I'm on the hook of it, unless there's that exit clause or the broker relieves them of it. And again, I'm, as a broker myself, I get agents when I am representing the seller. They like to ask, hey, is the seller going to be paying for my commission? Well, no, we don't know about that until you provide the offer. That is what is negotiable. So that's where things are, training people are kind of in the gray. They need to really understand that this is a negotiable thing, that the buyer has agreed to pay it. Now, whether the seller actually agrees to give a credit or not, that is completely at the discretion and at the negotiation of the purchase contract. Now, the DRE likes to get in a little bit more about practices licensees should avoid. So failing to provide a written agreement. As we know, everything should always be in writing. That is always the best practice. And compensation needs to be extremely clear. What the expectation of being compensated is needs to be extremely clear. And the terms of it as well. Dual agency needs to be properly disclosed. If you do not disclose dual agency properly, that is void. That is not a valid dual agency, because it needs to be agreed to in writing by both parties, disclosed and agreed to. Pressuring the buyer and requesting advance fees. So these are the practices licensees should avoid. That's what the department says. Now, licensees always are encouraged to thoroughly vet new practices with their affiliated brokers and legal counsel for compliance with applicable laws. So this is just kind of a little bit of a cursory understanding of this, but please consult to the Department of Real Estate, your broker, legal counsel, the appropriate resources to get the most up-to-date, accurate information. And again, check out that link below for the actual advisory by the Department of Real Estate and that video that the commissioner has posted. If you have any questions, make sure to consult the right resources for those people. But for those things, I am Schyler with Accredited Real Estate Schools. I hope this was a little bit informative of this ever-evolving changes to now how our buyer-broker representation and compensation is structured. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great rest of your day.